Hello everyone! Now, I don't know about you, but for me personally, I find Commander to be the most revealing of all of Magic's formats. Like, yeah, I can probably get an inkling of what you are like based on whether you gravitate towards Mill, or Titan, or Control in Modern, but there's something beautiful that comes out when people are unmoored from the constraints of needing to respect a meta, and are just able to run the cards that truly speak to them. It is one of the main draws of the Commander format, I feel, being able to witness what people reach for in this casual show-off fest. There's something really endearing about it. I feel like this revelation of mine really started around the time I started doing Commander deck reviews on my weekly Tuesday and Sunday streams. Now having looked at over 750 decks on stream, wow, I literally can't believe that number, I feel like I've identified some fulcrums upon which Commander players lie that they don't realize. Basically, there's a lot of ways to go about building a Commander deck, and every one of those paths can be the right one for you, but there's also a good shot that you end up following a path that conflicts with your nature as a player if you don't know what you're looking for, leading to a bad experience. This video, in a way, I kind of see as an extension of my flowchart one, where we will go through player preferences I see commonly and also go over what bespoke pieces of deck building advice I would give them. A little disclaimer like the last one, you don't have to ascribe to the whole personality. This is certainly a spectrum type of ordeal. Think less of these like absolutes and more like sliders. Okay, that being said, this video is going to be a bit of an alignment chart of sorts, or more of like a quadrant chart, I get, personality matrix with like multiple axes you can whatever. Here are the three axes I've identified that we will go over in this video. 1. Linear versus nonlinear. 2. Involved versus uninvolved. And 3. Subtle versus spectacular. Let's just go ahead and start. Firstly, we have the linear and nonlinear axis. Now, of these two, I feel like linear can kind of have a bad connotation, but it really doesn't have to. Let's start there and explain why. Firstly, in the linear camp, you can be a gimmick deck builder. Once again, powerful word there, but in my mind, most of the time, someone who builds a deck around a gimmick understands it to be one note and expects the deck to come apart in a month or so, and is just looking to have a fun time with that toy before moving on to the next one. You see, instead of getting variance from a single high variance deck, their variance thrill comes from cycling through different one-note decks throughout a year. Here, to define a gimmick, I mean that it does one silly thing with low game-to-game variation, causing it to become stale quick. Now, some people love a gimmick to death, even if the deck does the same thing forever and ever. I'm sure there's plenty of gamers out there that found the deck for them that only does one thing that they'll never ever get sick of. But generally speaking, a gimmick player in this camp will pick up new decks and quickly retire them just as fast for a new one once that one interests them more. My advice to gimmick deck enjoyers is to take heavy note of the tutors in each color and actually start building your decks from there, as to always have the most consistent experience possible in the short window of time that your decks last. There are so many other types of linear decks too though, not just gimmick decks, so let's touch on other archetypes that fit under the linear umbrella, such as our next topic, combo decks. Now, keep in mind, I'm gonna use the combo word very literally here. Like, these won't all win the game on the spot like a true infinite combo, but they could instead create a prisony type of effect like this evil amalgamation of cards. Feel free to pause and read them if you're a sicko. Basically, what I'm getting at here is you want finishers that mix multiple of your favorite cards in a synergistic way to create a winning state for you. I feel like combo players are afflicted with the most amount of pitfalls of any other player. Firstly, a lot of combo players might manage their deck's power by not including tutors in order to balance it out. This on the surface seems like a good way to make a casual combo deck more fair, but the issue is you don't actually lower your deck's ceiling by doing this. You are still able to naturally draw the combo and win super fast, even without tutors. Instead, what you are doing by nixing tutors is lowering the floor of your deck, which can lead to frustrating gameplay experiences as you have non-games that make you feel like you wasted a night with your friends, because you never ever get to threaten your giant combo play. Secondly, I find that most, not all, just most, players get kind of sick of their combos after a while, and I think this is caused by a couple of different things. Firstly, taste can just change. I used to love my Judith Aristocrat's Death Touch pinging monstrosity, but I feel like I've gotten my mileage out of that deck and its theme. Like, it lasted for a good 4 years as one of my decks, and that's a pretty good record, and it's still a deck I would recommend to anyone without a doubt looking for a fun Aristocrat combo option. Secondly, you could get really burnt out from your deck if it doesn't have just a linear win, but also a linear buildup. My Kira deck here is a great example of what to do. It always wins with the same few combos, but what makes the deck fun is the desperate and insane lines you need to take in the mid game that involve sacrificing all of your lands to generate insane mana, tutoring the right cards to get advantage, removal, and protection that you need, and the multiple merit lages that you need to sacrifice to power Matter's draw effects to the point where you have all the combo pieces and enough mana to send them. Despite all the tutoring and the identical combo finishes, Kira is a deck that has no two games that are alike because there's a lot of variation in the middle of the deck's game plan. You can also invert this and have a more stable early game but a less deterministic combo end. This is what my Kellen deck does, where its central core strategy is super linear hate bears, but it always ends with either Elish Norn and Kudo or Brizella and Gaddock, both of which are imperfect finishers that can definitely favor me to win, but can have holes poked through them. For this deck, the variance that keeps it fresh doesn't come from my gameplay line, but instead from how I respond to my opponents trying to interact with me while assembling my pieces, as well as how they try to break out of the soft lock when it eventually comes to fruition. Lastly, I find that combo players will often run cards that outperform their favorite aspect of their list just because it's optimal to do so. Skip the Craterhoof if your green go-wide deck plans to win with a Rube Goldberg machine combo. It's not a good backup plan if it is a stronger plan than what you want your deck to do. Whew. Okay, that was a lot of talk about some of the true linear side of this equation. So now it's time to get on to my favorite example of an archetype with a neutral stance, meaning a deck with equal amounts of linear and non-linear elements. That being all you mid-rangers of the world. You wouldn't necessarily think of a standard mid-range plan as a linear deck. Remember, like I said, it's about spectrum, so this one is less linear than a combo list would be, but more linear than any of the true non-linear decks we'll get into soon. Even though your threats are varied, and your accelerants are too, at the end of the day, you're still playing X number of ramp spells and X number of parity breaking plays. If you are rocking a 3-mana commander that wants to come down ASAP, something like 6, who has a valuable attack trigger, you'll probably jam-pack your deck with 1-mana accelerants like Mana Dorks or Ramp Auras to play it with as much consistency as you can by turn 2. Here, instead of getting linearity by way of winning with a specific card every game, we're getting it instead by card archetypes. At the end of the day here, the pieces are different in a literal sense, but the tempo game to game follows a similar rhythm. The best advice I can give to mid-range gamers is to recognize your power spikes. As mentioned prior, if your commander is a powerful 3-drop, you should be accelerating on 1 mana, and maybe leave those Nature's Lures and 3 Visits in the binder. If you're oops all 7 drops, try to grab yourself as many Everflowing Chalices and other 1-for-2 ramp spells that you can. Your curve is paramount for your success in games and needs attention dearly. But you can also be easily tripped up by having the wrong ratio of cards. Too much or too little ramp, not seeing a bomb on time. These are things that can cause a deck strain, and it can lead it to become frustrating to play. I recommend playing with a hypergeometric calculator and playtesting until you feel like you have those ratios right before committing to a deck. I go over how to use those tools in my original complete deck building guide video if you want a further in-depth look into using these kinds of calculators. Alright, lastly we have ourselves the decks that are full-blown variance machines. Never will you have a game with one of these archetypes that mimics one previous to it. Now, the danger with this type of deck building is you can have some seriously low floors, like abysmal games, because truthfully, to get the highest amount of variance possible in a game of Commander, you need to leverage something you truly can't control. Your opponents. Well, you can control your opponents if you're a sicko, but you get what I mean here. Your opponents are the most variable part of Commander, and by utilizing their threats against them in something like a Theft deck, or by manipulating table dynamics like in a Politics deck, you can create truly one-of-a-kind moments because your deck leverages the table as part of its gameplay loop instead of internal synergy. You'd probably love something like a Goad deck, or a Thada Adele deck, where you just run ramp and ways to make her unblockable and try winning with your opponent's Bolas's Citadel, Aetherflux Reservoirs, Equipments, or Triplicate Titans, or whatever else they might run, and use next to no game-ending threats of your own. You don't have to full commit all the way like that. You can instead opt to have some elements of this opponent manipulation in a deck with an otherwise regular structure. This is what has kept Farrakha very fresh to me. The ability to grant opponents death touch blockers using her activated ability is great deal-making potential, and she's also the perfect Constellation rapid-fire machine when you use it on your own graveyard, since the snakes are enchantments. So if you want a true high-variance deck that never ever plays the same as it did last time, try building one that is built around reaching across the table that plays with your opponent's toys or table dynamics at least a little bit. For full variance cravers, you can also get creative with the Commander format without needing to tread into Theft or Politics, nor do you need to reach into the wretched Quirk-Chungus realm of Rule Zero Commander. Like, for example, I imagine one day my Cormella deck, which is Oops All Big Spells, will soon have so many side graves that I just sleeve them all up and shuffle them before the game. I'll have 75 set-in-stone concrete cards, and then I'll just shuffle in 25 random of the big 6 mana or greater spell pile, so that way it's a mystery every game about which ones I have or not. There are other funny things you can do in this department, like a flying deck, but every time you kill an opponent with one or more flying creatures, you have to choose one and remove them from the deck at the end of the game for a different alternate flying threat at that mana value or something. Setting funny rules like this can keep a deck fresh forever. Alright, hopefully we've taken some decent advice from this linear and non-linear talk and figured out what side of the slider there you are mostly on. Let's now talk about another pillar of Commander decks that I find people neglect and miss in their diagnosis of their deck building failures. That being the tension between involved and uninvolved decks. Let's briefly define our terms here, starting with the deck building angle. By an involved deck, what I mean is one that is built around some evergreen things that make it highly susceptible to new side grades and upgrades. +1/+1 counters, power 4 greater matters, flying decks. These are wide archetypes that basically receive a couple of new considerations with each set. Inversely, an uninvolved deck will be one that is built around really narrow archetypes of cards that receive very infrequent support. Curses, scarecrows, morph. There are really too many one-off mechanics or niche creature types you can build around to name here. If you constantly feel stressed by the barrage of new sets and don't want to keep track of every single new card that comes out and just want a deck to sit still, then an uninvolved deck would be far more your speed. But this can be poisonous to a player who craves that feeling of a deck that's alive, where every set is Christmas Day and it brings new fun toys to play with. I find that a mixture of both is the most enjoyable for myself. Something, for example, like Saphara is a flying deck, yes, but the aggressive Voltron way I built her means that she only particularly cares about cheap flyers that can come down turn 3 or earlier to help cheat her out. This double stipulation of needing to be cheap while also needing to have flying is what stops Saphara from being a deck that gets upgraded every single set, but still keeps me interested. The same is true, for example, Cormella. Spellslinger is a really wide archetype that gets a lot of support, but big spells is a narrow enough theme that I typically only get 1, maybe 2 new considerations for her each set. I promise that Secrets of Strixhaven is just a huge outlier. I have like 20 new big spells to try out from the set. It's insane. Anyway, what I'm trying to get at here is one of the most important things you can do before building a deck is taking note of how often you want to be able to shake things up with your new list, and divining if what you are about to make is going to fall in line with those preferences. Don't be me. Don't build Linda and then get really bored when they don't release curses for 12 million years. Anyway, let's move on to the other end of the involved and uninvolved spectrum, and that is the gameplay element of this axis. An involved player is one that craves a deck that presents a high amount of choices within the gameplay of the list, whereas an uninvolved player would like a more set-in-stone path to follow. Let's talk about some of the previous examples we've used to illustrate what I mean here. An involved player would probably really enjoy a deck with a lot of tutoring and hate bears with a toolbox kind of engine. Being able to read your opponent's boards and pick out the perfect silver bullet is a great way to stay focused and engaged on the game at hand. Control is another really involved strategy where you need to gauge each opposing threat carefully and deny the correct one lest you pick wrong and let a different player snowball out of your grasp. This can also manifest with using niche cards that don't really get the light of day in other formats. I know I personally love to jam Toppelgeist in as many decks as I can, and I literally built a deck around Brazella. Like, come on, these are turbo-involved decks. Inversely, uninvolved players would still benefit from removal. Of course, you need to be able to worm your way out of hate pieces and also stop wins, but their decks are probably going to manifest in ways that are less grindy than an involved player's would. This manifests in turn as decks that run a lot of high floor cards. Consider what your average Prosper Tomebound deck would look like, or Azusa Single But Looking. These are decks that are very straightforward, high floor game plans. We can see a big tension arise here that makes for an interesting balancing act. Uninvolved deck enjoyers would probably prefer a high floor deck that runs a lot of consistent staples for gameplay, so they always feel included in their games. And involved players would like narrow decks that highlight an aspect of themselves, that are also constantly positioning them to make decisions. Deck building wise, the inverse is true though. A staple heavy deck betrays the uninvolved player's want of a deck that sits still, and the niche archetype involved deck builder will probably not get a lot of new arcane spells for their funky splice onto arcane deck that they love so dearly. What to do? The goal is to set some focal points to rein your deck in some. Azusa Oops All Ramp Matters will win you your games as an uninvolved leaning player. It's a very wide theme that can do a lot. But so will Azusa with the sub-theme of Eldrazi. Now you don't have to worry about all those pesky landfall cards we get every set, because that's not what your deck is about. You only really have to worry about upgrades now when the Eldrazi come knocking. Inversely, setting a focal point for your deck can help in other ways as well. For the example of the Splice onto Arcane deck, did you know that when you copy a Splice spell, the whole thing gets copied? We get a lot more spell copy support than we do Arcane support. So leaning into a more wide-angle strategy with those narrow payoffs you love here can actually broaden your side grade potential, making the deck stay alive. Okay, now it's time for the final axis I find the average Commander player needs to grapple with. That being the difference between spectacular and subtle decks. We all know a Timmy or R1, and the Land of Spectacle is exactly the home for them. To me, a Spectacle player wants to gear up for big plays or turns. You're likely this kind of player if you enjoy taking the first 4 turns off of the game ramping or setting up a giant explosive storm turn, if you love cheating something big with Reanimate or Sneak Attack, or if you love winning with a gimmick card like Meld Creatures, Throne of the Grim Captain, or Mech Titan Core. I find that a common pitfall for players described here is that they will often fail to deck build around interaction and end up falling into the trap of being gimmicky, even if they want this deck to be long-lived. For decks that lean out of narrow threats and into more redundant ones, this may not be an issue. For example, the earlier mentioned green mid-range deck, where it is formed around an early land ramp game plan into a swath of top-end threats. Here, one of the 16 or whatever game-ending threats that you have getting answered isn't the end of the world because the foundation of the strategy is land ramp, one of the most stable forms of acceleration in the game, so it's easy to untap next turn and replace the removed beast with one of the 5 monsters that are waiting in your hand. For a commander deck that can accelerate in more fragile ways, like reanimating, or that seek to win with a specific subset of cards like a secret commander deck, I would call protection paramount if you want a deck that doesn't lose its luster quickly. Anyway, if you're worried about the prospect of a stompy or secret commander deck drawing all the table's ire, there's a perfect side of this equation for you. Those being subtle decks. Subtle decks do not accelerate, and instead take advantage slowly. They can still make big plays, like it's hard to have an unimpactful Ink Shield or Selfless Squire, but before that tipping point, the deck shapes the course of the game with smaller actions and less explosive synergies. Goad and Control are perfect fits for this kind of subtle side deck building. My big warning to those subtle gamers out there: advantage doesn't always transition into a win. Being able to close out the game at a reasonable pace is the hardest hurdle you're going to have to face, and it is often what stops me from building a more subtle deck that likes to take things low and slow. A mixture of both is also possible to achieve, with the perfect example being my aforementioned Safara deck. The deck is built around playing a life-linking 7/7 commander for 1 mana. That is super explosive. But the ways in which it accrues advantage more long-term is subtle, using flying stacks pieces to slow opponents down, monarch cards that I then pillow fort due to my flying indestructible board, and flyers that draw me cards to keep me in the game. It also uses board wipes that either save a creature and wipe the rest, or that are cheap enough that they can be used alongside spare protection spells or spirit bonds to help Safara survive, in order to make them one-sided when I'm ahead, or if Safara is permanently imprisoned in the moon, they can be great when I'm behind. The dynamics of the explosive commander plan A with the slow burn grindy value of the 99 makes it the perfect duality of these two extremes in my opinion. And that just about does it. This was probably my longest scripted video yet, so hopefully you liked it. Where do you and your lists fall on the spectrums presented here? Was there a deck you built that failed? Did this video help give you the vocabulary for why that deck didn't end up working for you? Let me know down in the comments below, and until next time, bye! For example, they could instead create a prisony type of effect like this eagle amalgamation. Oh no, the eagle amalgamation. Oh no.